Water? Tea? Okay. She knows it. That's good. Okay. We'll go for time. It's 8:30. Can't believe on time. 2 minutes? The watch must be slow. Maybe not. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. And we are about to get started with our 3-step program of learning Torah in order to be stronger and more ready to serve Hashem this week. Make it special, make it count. It is, good things happening. It is the first step always to talk about what's going on the calendar. And we talk about what's going on in the calendar in order to position ourselves to be able to focus on what we need to be doing. We look around, there's always somebody else doing something that looks so exciting and so good. There's always somebody else who looks to be much more successful than us, or looks like they have it all going well. And the trick of this world is that we got to do what we need to do, and we don't have to worry about everyone else unless it's what we need to do. So we look at what's going on in the calendar, and we ask ourselves, what should we be doing this week? We look at what's going on in the Parshah. We ask ourselves, what's the Parshah telling us this week? And then, as always, we look for one practical, relevant message that can help us in our Vaeira, and tonight we're going to do exactly that. So let's start off what's going on the calendar. Today is Chof Ches Shvat. Tonight is Chof Ches Shvat. Koyach Teves. And Koyach always being a special time where Hashem gives us Koyach, but also it tells us that we're almost at the end of the month. Tomorrow, Chof Ches. After tomorrow, Chof Tes. And then we'll become Aleph of Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Every time we have Rosh Chodesh, it's a special time, but certainly when it comes to Rosh Chodesh Shvat, it's one of the big milestones in the lead up to getting ready for Yud Shvat, the 11th day of the 11th month, Tavshin Yud Aleph, the 11th year. It was a big day in the Chabad calendar, but also, it's also because on Yud Shvat, besides for the day being the day the Rebbe gave us the first Maimah as a Rebbe, it's also the day where we mark the anniversary of the Istalkus, the passing of the Friediger, the previous Rebbe, the man who stood up to Stalin, the man who brought Chasidus Chabad from Europe and Shtetl over across the Atlantic Ocean to the Chatzi Kador HaTachten, the lower hemisphere if you put Israel on the top. And that's where the Friediger Rebbe moved the entire focus or center of Chasidus Chabad specifically from the Haim, from the Shtetl, into the big country, into the golden Medina of its time, into America. And there the Friediger Rebbe continued to spread and further the Hasidic goals of being very much in tune with the big wide world. Not because we are influenced by the big wide world, but as the Hasidic saying goes, a Chassid macht asviva. A Chassid's job is to create the influence, to create the atmosphere. And that's exactly why the Friediger Rebbe moved over to America, because there would be more influence. Equally, at an earlier stage, when Friediger Rebbe left Russia, he had a choice of where he was going to move, and eventually moved the center to Poland. And he was there until the Second World War, because that became a central place in which he could influence, and then moved to America, and from there continued to influence until this very day, an enormous wave of goodness all across the world. And the trick is that we're looking for the ripple effect of a one wave waves into another wave, and together it turns over the whole world into a world of goodness, which is what Yud Shvat very much focuses on. So why is Rosh Chodesh a milestone in that preparation? Well, obviously it's the beginning of that month, but in addition to Rosh Chodesh being the beginning of the month of Shvat, it's one of those dates, the 3 markers in which Tavshin Mem Zayin, the Rebbe, encouraged people to set themselves milestones or benchmarks or goals along the way, in which we would check and reassess our journey towards coming to a day like Yud Shvat, better prepared mentally, emotionally, and of course spiritually in our service to Hashem and finding our innermost self. And this is one of the days Rosh Chodesh Shvat, there was traditionally a test in the yeshivas to mark and the self-assess where their own growth is, and equally everybody in their own way. It's a great moment to reassess where we're headed, where we've come so far, and what else we would like to achieve in the coming days up until Yud Shvat. It happens to be that the day of the month of Shvat is big for us because it has in it Yud Shvat, which is the anniversary of the Istalkus of the Friediger Rebbe. It also has in it Yudal Shvat, the anniversary of our Rebbe becoming Rebbe. In addition to that, from Tavshim and Ches 1988, it also became the anniversary of the Istalkus of the Rebbe's wife, Rebbe Tzimchaya Mushka, which was a massive change up in how the Rebbe, A, interacted with the public, and B, also in the stages of preparing the world for Geula, redemption. In the amount of talks that the Rebbe spoke openly about Geula, about Mashiach being imminent, being so close, and something that has to become much more front and center, not just in the subconscious, in the underlying background, but to become out into the front and fore. And in a way, Chof Beis Shvat, the 22nd of Shvat, which is coming up in this month, the coming month, which we will start this week, is a day in which we ask ourselves how much of our day is influenced by the imminence of Geula. Now, everybody, at least should, believe that Mashiach is coming, and that Mashiach is coming imminently. And that's what was true for generations. But in the generation, the Rebbe encouraged us to take it one notch more, and to remind ourselves not only that Mashiach can come every day, and not only Mashiach will come as soon as he can, but to realize in a way of prophecy. These are the words that Rebbe used. In a way of nevuah, we have a modern day prophecy that a Mashiach, our Redeemer, is imminently arriving. And that's a game changer. So when we talk about what we're going to learn from the Parshah, when we talk about why we're going to shul to daven or davening at home, when we talk about why we would peel a potato or take out the rubbish or go for a breath of fresh air or go for a shlof, the main driving factor in all of the above and everything else equally, constantly, should be an awareness that we are on those final footsteps to Geula, where our reality can be upgraded. Now, the world around us doesn't always seem so obvious to be that way. That doesn't change the fact. And if anything, it should just make us realize how much we need to keep reminding ourselves. I don't know if the word is reminding, but reminding ourselves, making sure that it's the front and center of our mind constantly, that we are on those final steps for Geula, and this is who we are. So if we're talking about what's going on the calendar, we're getting into the month of Shvat. To us, the month of Shvat has tremendous importance, but it all boils down to today being right at the footsteps, at the threshold of Geula, as the Rebbe often told us. So let's calendar up for today. What's going on in the Parsha? It's a fabulous Parsha. It's a fantastical Parsha compared to last week, which, as we spoke in the Shir, was one of the darkest, if not the darkest moments in the entire 5 books of the Torah. For the Yiddish people who found themselves in the dumps of Shemois, of servitude, in Mitzrayim, there wasn't a darker moment than what they experienced back in Mitzrayim. And the Parsha closed with Moshe Rabbeinu turning around to Hashem and saying, from when I've showed up to Paro, it's only gotten worse. And this week's Parsha opens up with Hashem saying to Moshe, Shmi Hashem, lo yedati Hashem. I've appeared to the others, but I never allowed them to see what you and the Yidden are about to experience. It's about to happen, the outgrowth of the tremendously uncomfortable, inconvenience is an understatement, but terror of living under the regime of Paro. The Pharaoh was so mean and cruel to the Yiddish people, and Hashem says to Moshe, the outgrowth of this is going to be something that has never been presented even to the forefathers. And that will include Hashem redeeming and whisking out the Yidden, who at the time were just called the Hebrews, out of the shackles of Mitzrayim and bringing them out through the desert to receive the Torah, and eventually to bring them into the holy land of Eretz Yisrael, where we will be able, as a people, to live in the words of Hashem, to live in the land of Hashem, and thereby being able to live in the ways of Hashem in a way that even the others were not able to. This is what Hashem says to Moshe. And it's a promise. It wasn't reality yet. In the reality the Yiddish people were living in, Moshe and Aaron are trying to change the world in the direction and under the directives that Hashem had instructed them. Similar to what we do today, where we know the end of the story is going to be fantastical, but we also see the reality so far from it. Yet. And that's exactly what Moshe and Aaron and the Yiddish people around them experience. When they start to begin to have little cracks in the cruelty of the Mitzrayim, and the servitude starts to lessen slightly, but it's still not over. They're still slaves. The work gets put on hold because Mitzrayim starts going into panic mode, into survival mode, because there's plagues, the Makkos start to come. Moshe goes into Paroi and first gives him a warning, and he shows him the trick of the snake, where he throws his stick onto the ground and it turns into a snake. And he says to Paroi, look, Hashem is telling us to come and tell you, you must let the Jews go free. And Paroi tries to laugh it off and say, oh, we can also do that magic trick. We've got loads of magicians around here. We can all take our sticks and throw them onto the ground and turn into snakes. And of course, Aaron grabs hold of his snake and turns it back into a snake, turns it back into a stick. And as it is a stick, it swallows up all the slithering snakes of the Egyptian magicians. Paroi is still not fazed. He doesn't let the Egyptian people go out. He doesn't have a few other signs, the signs of the water turning into blood. But Paroi is not fazed. So Moshe Rabbeinu says to Paroi, you don't want to listen? You're going to be plagued. The river Nile and all the waters in Mitzrayim are going to turn into blood, and that's exactly what happens. And there's no water to be had across all Mitzrayim, and nobody slept through this one. Everybody knew there was no fresh water. There was no fresh water to be had. It was a whole big deal. They had to get fresh water from Eden, and that lasted the whole week. And then afterwards, as Moshe Rabbeinu cancels that plague ends, and then there comes the second plague, Atzvardeya, the frogs, followed by the plague of Kinim, Arov, the wild animals, Dever, where the domesticated animals die, Shchin, the boils. And then for the seventh plague, we have a Barad, which was the hailstones. And what was amazing about these hailstones, that they weren't just hail, and they weren't just big hailstones, they were actually hailstones that set things afire, because they were burning hot, and at the same time, frozen, freezing cold. And the combination of fire and ice came pelting down, set things afire. And Paroi still has his heart hardened and says and refuses to let the Yiddish people go, just like Hashem had told Moshe at the outset. He's not going to let Paroi get away with giving in easy. Paroi is going to insist, holding on till Hashem manages to clearly demonstrate the full weight of his punishment, of his education for the Mitzrayim, and of course the education of the Yiddish people, who will witness the great and tremendous plagues that Hashem would put upon their former masters, so that they should know. Us Yiddish people should appreciate that Hashem is in charge, even of nature, and Hashem controls everything, even the superpowers. And although it doesn't seem this way, it took a change-up of all the rules of nature, so that it should be clear demonstration at the outset and foundational years of us becoming a people, to remind ourselves that at the foundation and core of what makes us Yidden is the appreciation that Hashem is always in control. Okay, so here we have Parshah of Vaeira, 7 out of 10 plagues, fantastical revelations, and the beginning of the promises that became the Yetziah of Mitzrayim, the Exodus, which are quoted in the Haggadah that we read on Pesach. We quote this week's Parshah, especially the beginning, which has the 4 expressions of freedom, all included in Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, what's interesting is that as well as the actual miracles of the Exodus, we also gain some mitzvahs from the Exodus. Which mitzvahs become a mitzvah because of Yetzias Mitzrayim? Loads. Loads of mitzvahs are associated with Yetzias Mitzrayim, including tefillin, and mezuzahs, and kiddush. And you've probably guessed, the mitzvah of Pesach is a big time mitzvah that it's all about Yetzias Mitzrayim. What's the mitzvah of Pesach? The mitzvah of Pesach is to make sure to eat matzah, and equally to not have chametz. And that's a mitzvah that clearly is there to remind us of the foundation of what makes us into our nation, the foundation that's laid out in this week's Parshah, that Hashem is in control of everything. So much so that when we have Hashem in the Aseres Adibris, that we're going to read in a few weeks, he wants to put out who he is, his job description, his titles, who I am, his CV. He doesn't say, I am the Lord who created heaven and earth. I am Hashem who took you out of Mitzrayim. And that's where our starting point is. So in this week's Sedra, we have the beginning of Yetzias Mitzrayim and the mitzvahs that follow. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the fascinating life messages that this leads to us. And as we said, this is foundational of Yiddishkeit, and certainly foundational to us who are still grappling with the dissonance of Galus, where on the one hand we know that Yiddishkeit is supposed to be do the right thing and everything will be fine and dandy. Yet at the same time, as long as we are in Galus, as long as we do not have the Geula yet, life will never be perfect. And even as we witness the world becoming more and more ready for Geula, it's still not perfect, because although it's becoming more in tune with the destination, we're not there yet. And so long as we're not there yet, we will always be getting closer until that's actually here, maybe speeding now. One of the examples that's often given is of how the world is becoming a more Geula-style world. You look around and you see how the world shuns terror and even battles, and even shuns the strongest of people if they use their power just to exercise power. Instead, the world gives honor to kindness, and the world gives honor to peace. Sometimes it's a long journey to get there, but the world is starting to appreciate things that up until now were in the background. Equally, some of the funny examples is the concept that is brought down many a time in Kabbalah, that although in any relationship you have a giver and a receiver, and up until recently the giver has always been viewed as the more dominant in a relationship, Kabbalah tells us that when Mashiach comes, the recipient will rise higher than the giver. So if we receive Kedusha from great levels of godliness, we as the recipients who are working with the godliness given to us will rise above those levels of godliness. Equally, if you have in the biology of the creation and forming of human children or any children, there's a giver and a receiver, the masculine and the feminine. So usually you think of the giver as the more dominant one. And we are told that the receiver is actually, when the times of Geula, going to be much greater than the giver. Sounds strange. Sounds counterintuitive. But this is exactly where we are headed, to a time of nurturing having more importance than hunting. Which actually, if you think of it in those terms, makes a lot of sense. And at a certain stage, everything's been brought to the table. Now the more important stage will become to be able to nurture and develop those goodness that has been brought home. To borrow the analogy of the hunter and the nurturer. This exactly explains why you might have a world that is trying to champion women's rights, even if they're getting it upside down and they're getting it backwards, where they're trying to make women's rights into women have to be givers rather than nurturers. It's upside down. But the concept, or you have a Go'ola mindset where a feminine aspect is being championed and pushed forward, at least somewhat. But here we're going to talk about another entire angle, which starts off with a conversation where in the Sikha, fascinating, the Rebbe talks to the concept of stuff, matter, things that are tangible, compared to, and in contrast to, things that are less measurable, certainly less quantifiable, in the sense that they're not as coarse, as materialistic. But even from a, you can use the word secular, but a purely scientific or experiential understanding, we can appreciate that there's something to be said about the abstract as well. And in the Sikha, we compare these two, and we're going to highlight the need for not just doing the things that need to be done, to appreciate that behind the stuff that are being done, the feeling, the emotion, and perhaps even before that, the value that is given to the cause for which we are doing has enormous value that needs to be explained, described, and discovered. And when we have that in front and center, we can then go back to all the things that we're doing with a renewed energy. And a simple mashal, an anecdote, or a metaphor that will help us explore this contrast, which of course is going to be a message from this week's Parshah and how it could play into our life. The Shir prepares, it's not in the Sikha, but in a question about restaurants, hospitality. So let's just say you decided to open up a restaurant and you're hoping to do well. That's why you did it. Or maybe you opened up a hotel and you're going to bring people in and you're hoping people are going to come back. So what is the most important elements in making people feel that they want to come back? What would be the key ideals, concepts that you as the entrepreneur of your new restaurant should make sure to do and not forget to do? Now, the way I'm going to ask you to think about it is, when you walk into a restaurant you don't own, what do you want to make sure, what do you certainly want to have when you go in there that you definitely want to make sure that they have? Otherwise, you're not coming back so fast. So what would be a key element in a experience of going into a restaurant that you feel is essential for the success of any enterprise? It's a question about restaurants, but obviously it doesn't have to be eateries. It could be any sort of experience you go to, you're going to pay for. You go into a place to be served. What do you expect as a minimum or as a important value that's going to help you come back or want to come back again? Open-ended question. Anyone have any suggestions, please?
Strictly kosher.
Okay. So
very clean
kosher, it's got to be
and
kosher.
warmth.
One more time.
Strictly kosher, very clean and warmth. There has to be something about it, which some ambience about it, which makes you think I could really sit down and enjoy a meal in this restaurant. That's for some. I don't go out very often. That's what I'd like.
Okay. I'll tell you what. The first two I could get. Strictly kosher. It's got to have a kosher certificate and you've got to keep the laws of kosher. Got it. Okay.
Very
clean. Everyone has a different level of cleanliness, but we get it. got to be clean. You can't have rats and
no.
mice running around. You can't have, I don't know, overflowing bins. The dishes have to come back and they can't have yesterday's meal on it. Okay. What does it mean to be ambience that's welcoming? Talk to me more words. I'm listening.
Sometimes you go in, it can be very clean, but it can be cold and quite severe in a very modern restaurant, possibly. If you go into somewhere that's been there a few years, you either have somebody has said it's very good, or there's something about it. There's some warmth that may be in the colours, or the way people serve you, or the way people greet you when you go in. There has to be something about it which makes you want to either eat there or go back again.
Wow, interesting. So 1 second, are we talking about the heating, the temperature in the room?
No.
No, we're not talking. I'm just making sure.
Well, I mean, listen, I wouldn't like to go into a nice cold place when it's really cold like it is now. A little bit of heat so you can thaw your fingers before you look at the menu.
Okay.
I don't mean warmth just in central heating. I mean, there's got to be something about it which you say, yes, I feel like going to somebody's home. You want to feel comfortable. You want to feel that you're welcomed.
Okay, and we're going to hopefully talk more about what would make people feel welcome. But that's a great angle. Thank you. That was a great start. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one? We're talking restaurants for an example. If you had to set up a restaurant, what would you make sure as a number one key that people should be able to say, I want to come back?
I'd like all the patrons in the restaurant to say please and thank you.
Oh,
if I were running a restaurant, it'd have to be please and thank you. Those are like magic.
Magic words.
It's really lovely to be appreciated. People who work in restaurants work very, very hard. Yes. It's a very hard job. And I think to be appreciated is lovely.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one? Key element.
I have special diet, so just for health reasons, and if they could cater for that, that would make me very happy.
Okay, so if you had a number of restaurants that would cater to your dietary requirements, which one would you go back to? The one which had fill in the blank.
Things that you could eat.
Okay, so menu is very important. A good menu. Interestingly, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was recently a survey that argued that although the chef in the restaurant is very important, and being able to make tasty, good food is very important, but in actual revenue, as in what brought repeat customers or brought customers in, I think it accounted for maybe 20% of the overall importance. It's shocking because a restaurant is a food establishment. That's what it does. But their actual menu and the quality of the food accounted for 20% of the importance. And arguably, the point you made earlier about the warmth was maybe 60 or more % of what brought people back. Fascinating, at least to me, because when I go to eat food, I'm hungry and I want to eat food, right? But obviously, I don't have to go to a restaurant just to have food. That's not what we go for. You get to take out, or you make your own food if you're hungry. If you're going out to a place, it's because there's something about the place that will make me feel comfortable. And if that's missing, chances are I'm not going to come back. Okay. Now the Sikh is going to tell us that actually this sort of appreciation, this sort of exercise of looking at what makes us work, what talks to us, it's easy when it's not got much in it. Like the difference if I'm or I'm not going to go back to that restaurant isn't really going to make an enormous amount of difference in my overall life. However, the same concept will also apply to the things that do make an enormous difference in my life. And the Sikha also focuses that it's not just in what we do, it's also about what we don't do, the way we go about not doing it, and which things we have to stay away from. Actually, the Sikha starts off with what we don't do and how important, or which things are most important to not do, or how much we shouldn't do the things, and how unhealthy it could be for us to get involved in certain things. And then he uses that sort of comparison to then go back and say, well, equally, when it comes to doing the things we do, our starting and fundamental, foundational elements have to focus on the things that really matter. So let's just put this before we go ahead. If we had a choice to get a top-notch chef and a mediocre manager, or to have a top-notch manager and a mediocre chef, which one is going to likely be the more successful restaurant? The answer, without a doubt, a top-notch manager who understands people. Not a bad chef. A bad chef, okay. You know, he might chase out the people. They're not going to come back for the food. As long as the food is okay, doesn't have to be top. But that manager needs to run the establishment in a way that whoever walks into that room feels like they want to be there. And that's such a great experience. They can't wait to do it again. When they think about it, that warm, fuzzy feeling they have in association with the experience in that place, that's going to bring customers back. And it's not only about the money. It's the people that will be coming, will be people who appreciate that. So, let's tie it into this week's Parshah. And as we said, this week's Parshah is very much the foundation of the mitzvah of Pesach. And Pesach includes the mitzvah of not eating chametz, not having chametz, and eating matzah. But we have a very interesting halacha when it comes to saying don't have chametz. Now, in English, don't have chametz could mean multiple things. And it actually means all of them. Don't have something could mean don't eat it. Don't have something means don't keep it. And don't have something means you cannot own it. It can't be in your possession. This is one of my favorite topics when you ask somebody as just a random question about Yiddishkeit. So how many books are there in the Torah? Okay. How many, whatever. What is the worst thing that a Jewish person could eat? And of course, without a doubt, the worst thing you could ever eat is pork or chazah. Why? Because it's so unkosher. Really? What's so unkosher about it? Why is it any more unkosher than, say, a horse? Horse meat? Whatever. It's unkosher. It's true. I don't want to play it down because it's very important to not eat pork. But actually, if you eat a lettuce salad that has bugs in it, perhaps arguably, you may be doing a worse off Vaeira by eating the bugs, which have multiple lavim in it. And if you're eating a full bug, which is actually common in a lettuce salad, it's even legal in some countries, like America, where you can have a certain amount of ratio of leaf to creepy crawlies. You're going to think to yourself, wow, this is a bit extreme, but that's actually the law because it's hard to check. So how do we decide what's more kosher or less kosher? Based on what the Torah says. But interestingly, when it comes to chametz, we don't only have that it's very unkosher to eat, you're not even allowed to buy and sell it. On Pesach, if one owns chametz, you can't sell it, you can't derive any benefit from it, which would mean that even if you had a fancy cake, you couldn't give it as a gift to your non-Jewish neighbor, because Pesach has already come in. You couldn't give it even to your pet dog. You couldn't even give it to a colleague at work for free. Because at the end of the day, by you giving that to a fellow human being, that human being will appreciate you for your gift a drop more. And that's forbidden. But that's still not unique only to chametz. There are other items that also have such an extreme prohibition. For example, yayin nesech. Wine that was used in an idolatry process or similar would also not allowed to be given as a gift to anyone. It's not as many items, but also we have certain things you cannot do business or derive benefit from some of the things that are forbidden. When it comes to chametz, the only, and this is unique, the only item that we may not own, bal yirah and bal yimatzeh, shall not be in my possession and shall not be found there. Can't own it, even if you're never going to use it again. Because it belongs to me and it's in my property, it's forbidden for that to take place on Pesach. And that's an extreme, extreme level. And what we're going to focus and zoom in on is that we're going to notice that certain items have a greater prohibition about them. And greater doesn't mean that it's a stricter punishment. it means that it's more toxic to us. That not only can we not eat it and consume it, internalize it, we can't interact with it. We can't even have it as part of our possessions. And that level of toxicness is so important for us to realize. The Torah makes a big deal out of Chametz and Pesach for our teaching for us to appreciate about the message it carries. And what we're going to look at in the Sikha is to think about how every item in this world, whenever we interact with it, something's going on. Chemistry, something's happening. However, some things are healthy for us to interact with. Some things are not healthy for us to interact with. And we have to stay away from them because they are unhealthy for us. Let's take a look at, this is a quote from the Rambam that describes how every item in the world actually has some level of chemistry that we interact with when we come in contact with them. Here, the Rambam's not talking about Aveiras or mitzvahs. It is in the book of law. It's in the halachas, the laws of the fundamentals of the Torah, Yesod Torah, in which the Rambam describes to us the world around us. Now, the Sikha actually, interestingly, explains, it's not this particular Sikha, but another Sikha explains how to understand the Rambam in the face of modern science. And fascinatingly, the Rebbe asks us to stay true to what the Rambam tells us, even if it looks different to what you might read in your science textbook. Let's read it inside first in the Rambam. We'll then go in there to the explanation and then bring it back to the conversation at hand. These four bodies, which is fire, wind, water, and earth, Eish, Ruach, Mayim, and Ofer, fire, wind, water, and earth, are the fundamental elements of all that was created under the sky. Now, there was a time in ancient science that we understood the universe to be made up of four elements. Nowadays, we understand there's much more elements than just the four, and we understand that there are sub-elements, and there are particles of matter that go deeper and deeper. But the body of everything that exists, be it human, beast, fowl, crawling creature, fish, plant, metal, precious stones, pearl, building stone, mountain, or a lump of earth, is a combination of these four fundamental elements. The Sikh then goes on to say, well, hold on 1 second, hasn't science moved on from that? How do we understand the Rambam? There's 118 elements nowadays, and the Rambam wants us to, the Sikh basically tells us, fascinating, let's just read inside, the elements that our sages addressed are not foundational in the sense of being indestructible and indivisible, although at the time we thought that this was true of these four elements. And this is true of at least discovered science argues that the 118 elements that we have discovered today are the indivisible, the corest of the parts, but these are also foundational. These four elements still retain their level of foundationalness in the sense that everything that exists is comprised of them. They are also relevant to the chemical elements. It's not about the chemical makeup, but every single creation, everything that we know, if it's a thing, is made up of a combination of these four elements. You might be able to break it down further, but there will always be these four elements in a combination. There are those who understand these elements as characteristics, which is another beautiful angle of how to understand the Rambam, such as cold, wet, hot, and dry. This is why our sages call them characteristics of nature in the Medrash Bamidbar Rabbah. So this is the Sikha explaining to us how to understand that the four elements that we are talking about, everything that we know of, everything, are comprised of these four: fire, water, earth, and wind. Hot, dry, wet, and hot and cold, wet, and dry. And these four elements make up everything. Now, why is that relevant to us? Because we're going to learn, and this is again in the Rambam, but in the Vaeira, Nevuchim, there's a fifth generic element. When we say generic, it means that all of the four elements are driven off this. This fifth element encompasses all the four elements. Unlike the four elements that emerge from it, the fifth element has no physical definition. not only doesn't exist in a particular place, it exists everywhere. Everything is an expression of this fifth element, and therefore it's not measurable. It has no definition. If it's not defined, you can't define it. You can't measure where it is and where it's not. But actually, everything that we know is driven on this. What's this fifth element? The fifth element is intangible and serves as the source from which the other four elements originate. Okay, so this is a little bit of, I won't call it science, but I think it's the underpinnings, the workings of things as we know it. It's important for us to realize that these four elements are alluded to in Kabbalah, but also alluded to in the creation. And in creation, we have matter as we know it, and then we have something, it's called the Choyma HaYuli, the power, the energy that allows things to exist, that allows things to take form. It itself is not yet in a way of form, but everything has to have this. Just to borrow from the Maimer of Basi Legani of this year, coming up to Yud Shvat, everything has life. But nobody can explain what life is. There's different levels of life. Some things are alive, but they can't move. Some things can move, but they can't comprehend or interact by speaking. Some things can speak. Some things don't even grow. But there's life in everything. But what life is, we can describe what it does. What it is eludes us because the definition that life has isn't in our remit to be able to define. It's what allows things to exist. If there was no such thing as alive, you wouldn't have human beings who are alive. But life doesn't define what a human is. It allows the human to become a human being compared to the animal, which is also alive. But life of an animal, haven't described what the animal is. The definition works off the assumption that there is already life, and there it's going to give a definition to this particular form of life. And this understanding that everything that we know has its definition, its length, its breadth, its color, its texture. But all of that is the materialistic expression of something that is intangible, being expressed in a particular form. And that intangibility is what we might call life, or the fifth element, or the core of what's going on inside. And here the Rambam wants us to understand that that life, just as it's undefinable, intangible, that life is also, at its core, across the board, everything has it. Some forms express it in one way, other forms express it in a different way, but it's all the same fifth element that's inside. And here we have the three prohibitions, the three levels of toxic interactions talk to the three levels of how deep something is. To put it in maybe blunt description, Hashem comes to Mitzrayim and destroys the Egyptian empire. Why? Because it was rotten. It was so rotten, it had no hope of rectification. What the Mitzrayim had gotten up to was so rotten, it had to be eradicated. How deep had the rotten got? If an animal is really bad, how bad? It's bad that it can no longer be left around and has to be put down. But what can we do with the skin? Can we still use the skin? Can we still use the meat of the animal? Or worse still, no, the animal's become toxic and it's contaminated. How bad is that? Can it still be buried in the backyard? No, it's more toxic than that perhaps. Perhaps it's radioactive and therefore has to be taken away or burnt because it's not only not a good animal, and not only is it not to be consumed, to be used because it's contaminated, perhaps it's going to give off, just in being in its presence, more toxicity. Its very core has been contaminated. Maybe that's that using that example, using that parable, we can now go back to Chametz on Pesach and begin to appreciate the Mitzrayim message that we mark and commemorate. We remind ourselves using the chametz matzah. Stay away from chametz. Invest yourself in matzah. Approach teaches us at these sort of levels. When we eat something, that's the most external usage of consuming something. Benefiting from something is a more subtle form of using an item. You haven't used eating it yourself, but you've used the reward or the benefit from the item in order to allow yourself to grow or benefit. And less still is, even if you don't benefit from it, just having it around, just possessing it, could be in even a deeper, but less coarse, more subtle way of engaging with something. Here we go. Let's read it inside. Forbidden foods are called asr. When they say, oh, this restaurant is asr, or this food is asr, or whatever else, this action is asr, what does it mean that something is asr? Here, the Alter Rebbe in Tanya wants us to think about the word asr. In modern Hebrew, you have the word asirim, or beit ha'asurim, which means a prison cell, or somebody who was locked up in the prison cell. And the Alter Rebbe wants us to think of the word asr in that context. If a piece of meat is asr, it's not just forbidden, it's tied up, it's locked up. Why is a piece of meat locked up? It's not locked up in a cell, but it's locked up in such a way that we cannot derive benefit from it. Here's the quote from the Tanya. If someone eats some erroneously for the sake of heaven, intending to use its nourishment to study Torah or pray, nonetheless, says the Alter Rebbe, I've used an item and I'm doing only good things with it. Nothing else. I've eaten this thing by mistake. I didn't intend to do an Vaeira. And I've used the energy now only to study Torah and daven. The nourishment does not attach itself to the words of Torah and prayer. It's trapped. It can't become holy. It is tied down to unholiness. And that's why the word asr is so appropriate for something that's forbidden. Because asr doesn't just mean forbidden. Asr also means it's locked up. It's unrefinable. It's trapped. It can't become holy. It's tied down to the unholy side. And therefore, even if someone only did it by mistake, and even if they're using it only for good purposes, it's locked. It's asr. And the word we'll be using until now, it's toxic. So if somebody was really, really thirsty, and they were so thirsty, and God forbid they had a drink of petrol because they wanted to quench the thirst, not only will it not quench the thirst, it's toxic, regardless of what intention they had, and regardless of what they were planning on using it for. It's still not going to quench their thirst. It's toxic. And this is how we understand something that to be asr. That something that's asr is going to break even the intended purpose. It's not going to allow itself to be refined. So now when we eat something, we benefit from its finished form, the edible form. On the ladder of how deeply something can become contaminated, the most external way of engaging it is the way it is completed. Think of a ready-made dinner. It's served on the table, but all the ingredients that are inside that dinner are not in their raw form. They've been very well prepared with all sorts of expertise, and together in their completed form, they now become edible, ready to eat food. And when we engage on that level, we don't interact with the elements, the abstract of those food items, but we're engaging in the completed, finished form of those foods. And when we derive benefit from something, then we don't have to only derive benefit from the completed form. We interact with the elements that form it. An interesting idea that asks us to look at the difference between eating something and engaging in commerce, buying and selling something. If I own a shop that sells pig skin belts and coats and handbags, have I done anything wrong? The answer is it's actually permitted. You can wear a pair of shoes made out of pigskin. There's nothing to stop us. It sounds really harsh. Oh, you give out, you're engaging in the pig. But actually, engaging or benefiting from the pigskin and having a thriving business of it hasn't allowed ourselves to interact with the external, with the actual to ingest it. And that's because we are only dealing with it as an external idea, not as the final form in which it takes. And the Sikha wants us to think of that as in almost like it's minus engagement. It's less engaging because it's only on the form of the elements that make it up rather than its final product. Compare that to actually, God forbid, eating chazarai. Now that's a real problem. Now, because I'm not only engaging in its potential element form, in its completed form, I'm allowing it to do something which will become internal to me. Now it's got a real issue. So here we have the prohibition, the also of eating talks to the final completed product. The issur of benefit, where one can't even buy and sell, is because we're arguing that the toxicity of this item isn't just in its final form, even more external, more abstract to that, even in its elementary form, where it's just elements, it's also become toxic, and therefore it's forbidden to benefit from it. So, if you go to a restaurant and the food is poisonous, food poisoning, definitely don't eat there. Definitely don't go back. Okay, let's just say the food was okay, but you went in there and there was no please and thank you. Let's say you went in there and it's not that the food was a problem, but something about the elements that were inside the hotel, inside the restaurant, didn't sit right and didn't gel. It's not as bad because you didn't get food poisoning, Baruch Hashem. But it's still, there's something else missing. There's something missing in the sense that the elements of what puts together this enterprise, I almost feel like uncomfortable being there. But there's something deeper still. What could be deeper than the feelings one has? What could be deeper than it's not just the matter, but it's even the feelings that one has? And here, Sikha wants us to understand that there's actually something that is not just how we benefit from it, how it made me feel. There's a driving life that's inside, that's at the core of what goes on, and that usually is right, and generally it's okay, but when that becomes ruined, it's so extreme, you cannot even allow yourself to be there. Perhaps the example for that would be a hotel that's really a restaurant that's really a setup. They don't even intend to serve food. Maybe, I don't know, it's a spying place or whatever else. Think of something really out there that's crazy. That's just evil. It should never have been begun. So it's not like I felt uncomfortable, but actually I realized that there's something fundamentally wrong with the problem so deep. I can't have any association with it. Even when I'm starving, I won't go in there. It's not only about eating it or benefiting from it. Having any sort of ownership with that item cannot be had. And there we have the idea that when it comes to chametz, it's not only that we can't eat it or do business with it or gift it to somebody, it cannot even be in our possession. Because the toxicity of chametz, the Mitzrayim message, is so harsh that it cannot be part of our reality whatsoever. And from the days of Pesach, we stay fully away to give ourselves that reminder that there's something that's an element that isn't just about how you feel, it's about what the value it stands for, what its driven force is. But here the Sikha takes us the entire other side. Because all this is what we shouldn't do and how we stay away from something. In the next 3 or 4 minutes, we need to explain how this works in the Asay Tov, in the positive, And more importantly, what does it mean for us practically? We're not opening up a business of restaurant, at least I don't think so. And if there's a restaurant we don't like, we just don't go. We don't need the whole explanation. But there's another side to it. And that side is really important to us. And that's the positive side. We think about what it means to certainly do the right thing. See if I have a slide for it. I don't know if I have slides to this. Okay, I think we have to skip. We'll do it outside. If we find the slide, we'll do it. When a person decides that they're going to, on the most final level, the completest level, the simplest level, the most quantifiable level of a person's interaction with the world is how we behave. Now, in Chassidus is going to tell us that behavior isn't just what we do, because that's certainly how we behave, but also how we speak. The words I use, whether I'm saying nice things or not nice things, Lashon Hara or Lashon Tov, refined language or unrefined language, how I speak, what I'm speaking about, who I'm talking to is also my behavior. And it goes one step further. It also includes what I allow myself to actively think about. Conscious thinking. Now, conscious thinking is a second cousin or a first cousin or a brother or almost the same as subconscious thought processes, but it's entirely different. It's a world of difference. Active thinking means I invite this thought on stage. And the opposite of active thinking is if I have a thought and I push it away and I don't let that thought have center stage, I don't allow it to be in the limelight, I am in control of my mind too. And therefore, it's considered a choice. What I will allow myself to actively think about or not. Subconscious thinking, Chassidus will tell us, what thoughts are in my mind, I can't really choose. What thoughts pop into my head, I also can't always choose. Sometimes I can, so I can't always. But active thinking, the word is entertaining a thought. Why is it called entertaining? Because we're giving it space. And therefore, thought, speech, and action, as an active thinking, speaking, and the things that I do are considered the comparison to eating, where we are dealing with definable, actionable, bottom line completion of whatever it is we're doing. And that's when we get to choose. Are we going to be focused on toxic or healthy choices of thought, speech, and action? And that's the most external level. Now, some things are so toxic, we would never engage in them. We would never talk about it. We would never do it. And we wouldn't allow that to be in the center stage of our minds ever, whenever we can help it. And then we have things that are a little more subtle than that. Not thought, speech, and action. They are emotions. And they are thought processes, ways of thinking, moods. Maybe sometimes a little harder to control. And sometimes it's okay to feel like I'm in a bad mood. It's not okay to say things that are going to make people in a bad mood. Because although I feel this way, I don't have to wear it on my sleeve. I don't have to share it or give it off. So some things are okay to feel sometimes. But some things are not okay to feel. And if I'm feeling that way, I have to urgently try and figure out how to shake it off. That's deeper. But at the core of what really counts and what's really important is something that isn't defined as machshava dibur ma'aseh, thought, speech, and action. It's not even midos. It's not even how we have our mood. Something deeper than that. And interestingly, the Baal Shem Tov is quoted as saying that there's something that's not an Vaeira, but it's worse than any. I think maybe it's Aaron Kalina actually who quotes in the name of Baal Shem Tov. It's not an Vaeira, but it's worse than any Vaeira because it's the doorway to all Aveiras. And at the core of what that is, in one word, 2 words, it's the avoida, the servitude of, the service of simcha. Choosing to be joyful. Be joyful means that life is important, more important than things, more important than achievements. And therefore, because I'm alive, that's what really matters. And life is the opportunity to make a difference, and that's what really matters. And life itself is joyful. There are worries that come with life. And people obviously say, oh, life gets in the way. Life doesn't get in the way. Things get in the way of life. And unfortunately, the way Hashem designed us, the challenge He set up for us is that this is forever going to be this way. The battle, the struggle between living life and focusing on existence. And here says the Sikha, there's something deeper than eating, deeper than benefiting. Some things are just the ownership of what we are, the 5th element. The 5th element is the life that lies behind something. At the core of what makes a food establishment important is that whoever is the entrepreneur is interested in making it successful, is interested in the value of what it carries. And in our life, we must have a joy of being alive, of being that representative, that emissary, that shliach of the Kadosh Baruch Hu to the life that He chose to be our mission. Hashem chose which life I would live. And that life, that appreciation, is the core of where my very rotzon lies. So being able to live a successful life and being able to live an uplifted life is secondary. The first and foremost thing is to appreciate that there's life itself. There's a rotzon that's deeper than it all. Now it's an idea that's a little abstract. That's what we said. It's intangible. It's undefinable. But that's at the core of what really makes something so important. Because whoever hires that manager of the restaurant, as long as they know they want to make it successful, they'll be looking to make the right choices. But if they're not interested in the hotel or the restaurant in the first place, if they've been distracted and sidetracked for something else, I'll never allow them to grow upwards. So at the core of what makes it a great place to be is when the staff and the people, you walk in and you feel like they're looking to make you feel comfortable. They're looking for your interest. If I walk into a place and I get the feel that no one's interested whether or not I'm happy or not, then even if they say all the pleases and thank yous politely, but they don't really care about me, I'm not going to feel like coming back. At the core of what needs to happen is people want to feel like they're appreciated. If I'm coming to spend my money at your place, the least you can do is be interested in seeing how I feel. But if you're bureaucratic about it and it's just paperwork or it's just technicalities, you have no interest in being here or servicing, there's not very good chance you're going to have people coming back. And at the core is an interest in being into the hospitality. Or in our language, the first step about being able to grow my Yiddishkeit is to being interested in the life that Hashem has given to me. Not in the things that I'm dealing with, or before I get to the things that I need to deal with, deeper still is to appreciate the simcha of just being alive, being that emissary. And when I have that, that's like the core, what allows them to be able to derive the benefits and then actually imbue and take in the goodness of the actions of our life. We learned something. Hashem should give us the koyach to be able to appreciate the goodness that we're doing, to be able to appreciate the simchas achayim, and more importantly, to be able to rejoice in knowing that Hashem has chosen us for the life that He's given us in our mission, and that itself should give us the success just by being rejoicing becomes already this vessel, the emunah and bitachon, that will bring all the good brachas. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.